The earth is the Lord's, and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow or reap the aftergrowth, or harvest the unpruned vines. For it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat only what the field itself produces. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building on it. Each builder must choose with care how to build on it. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one that has been laid. That foundation is Jesus Christ. These three scriptures are pulled from a larger text that have shaped the service this morning. Women theologians in Latin America have offered Anabaptist churches the world over resources to shape a Sunday in May that reminds us of who is really the owner of the earth and everything that is in it. They are calling on their sister churches the world over to remember that we are called to care for the earth, the community, the church. Ownership. It's a tricky word the world over, and it has been since the beginning of time. When people are in positions of any sort, with loads of power or even a small amount of power, there is usually a sense of ownership that is expressed in one form or another. Think about tiny little people, some of whom might have been up here for us already, who are really at the mercy of many factors in their lives. And what are some of the first words that are shouted at the first threat of a toy being taken away? Mine! I think we've heard that. You may have even said it at a time in your life, which might be met with a reply of, no, mine. And so the struggle of ownership has begun from the tiniest of tots. And I think if we listen carefully, sometimes we can hear adults shouting those same kinds of words. Many times before these words, or even before words, we hear the sound of this cry when something has been taken away by another, and it indicates that even these tiniest of packages of humans, we cry when our thought of ownership is being removed. These three passages that have been read for us today may seem like an odd combination. Yet they focus on three themes that were identified by the women theologians in Latin America to accompany this day in May. The reminder in the Psalms that the earth is the Lord's. The call for the restoration for the land and how it has been used to produce and yield its crops to the humans that work it. And the reminder of who really builds the church. These three texts from various parts and times in the Bible remind us of who is really the owner of the land, this earth, this church that we're all sitting in this morning. Maybe you have already figured out the answer to the question. Anytime we talk about ownership, we're doing so from a place of privilege, and we just need to acknowledge that. It takes money to own things. To own a home, to own a car, to have possessions, to be able to have things, you need some form of money. And we have that. We can buy houses, we can buy cars, we can buy education for our children and ourselves, we can buy clothing, we can buy food, we can buy things to fill our houses. We have privilege, we have access, we have means. And we all know that this is not the case for all of the people. For many in our community, our county, our state, our country, our sister countries who share our borders, our global sister countries from the world over, we hear the staggering reports of the people who live in poverty the world over, who sell their family members, usually their young children, in order to pay debts, who sell their daughters to be trafficked for sexual purposes, who sell their sons to be slave labor, in order to cover the loans that they had to take out to cover cost of living. Can we even imagine what it would be like to be so incredibly desperate that we come to the point where we sell our family members? We hear the horror stories of persons around the globe who work in factories in harmful conditions, ones that we would not put up with if it were us, so that we might have cheap clothing to wear, goods to consume. We have this strange relationship with the land that we inhabit, and we're not the only ones, and this is not something new. Land and the taking of land, the conquering of land, the overthrowing of the inhabitants, these patterns have been going on for centuries. We hear about it in the Bible when the children of Israel went into the land of Canaan. These lands were inhabited, and they were told to go in and take that land. How do we square that circle? We're not going to do that today. The taking of land, the conquering of land, the overthrowing of inhabitants, these practices happened the world over, all over Europe and Asia and Africa, Australia, North and South America. Maybe Antarctica is the only place that has not been taken in this way. I think we can figure out why. Colonialism has run rampant across all of these continents in one form or another. This thought that land is free for the taking, no matter who was there first and was making their home there. If you had power, if you had privilege, if you had might and sheer force of will, then you could have the land. While maybe now our ways of taking land have become more civilized, we have it in transactions, it can give us as humans this false sense of ownership, a false foundation on which to build our lives. And it has been a myth that has been perpetuated through generations. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. Do we remember that we really don't own a thing? Do we remember that instruction in the garden that was given? Do we remember that from the beginning, God has said to humankind, serve the land and protect the land? When really what has happened in too many cases, that we have exploited the land. Yet this psalm reminds us who is really the owner of the earth. It's not one of us, it is the Lord. This psalm was a celebration that was used to remember the goodness of the earth and the generosity of God to engage us with the earth. It was believed that this psalm was recited before going into the temple as a reminder that the earth is the Lord's and that all that we have and all that we are comes from and belongs first to God. These words call us to remember that without God we have and are nothing. Our earth cries out for many reasons. There are a number of reasons why people do not believe that climate change is really a thing or not. That is not a debate that I'm going to ask us to enter into, if you believe in climate change or not. But it is impossible to ignore the way humans have taken advantage of and are caring too little for the earth. If were more committed to thoughtful consumption, of being mindful of what we put in the trash and what we recycle, of reducing what we use as individuals, as families, as households, as this congregation, and looking for packaging that does not just continue to add to the piles of trash, it can make a difference. The enormous piles of garbage that are gathering in all of the seas would not be so horrendous if 8 million pounds of plastic ended in recycle bins instead of trash bins or tossed to the earth. We could all do our part to reduce our impact on the earth if we started remembering that we are stewards of the earth instead of simply consumers of the earth. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow or reap the aftergrowth or harvest the unpruned vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat only what the field produces itself. I know it's impossible to take a page from Leviticus, but I wish that we could. I wish that we could declare this practice of jubilee in a way that was described in that time. It would be incredible if we could really allow the earth a year to rest and allow the earth to restore and rebuild itself and regain strength, and that all the inhabitants go back to their places and all the lands go back to their original owners. It'd be something to see. All of chapter 25 is about ownership and who owns what and who owns who. It was a reality in the days of the children of Israel. The basic premise of ownership that the children of Israel carried with them throughout their time was this: God owned the land, God owned the people. We might not like the use of the word ownership when it comes to people and people being owned. I personally don't care for that, if we're looking at it only from how we as humans think that we own what we have. But thank heavens, God is not human like we are. And being owned by God is being owned by someone who always has our best interest at heart and always looks upon us with a fairness that our human eyes and our human ways cannot do. This is not an ownership that makes one subservient less than, but it's one that marks a person as being a son or daughter of God. That's what it means to be owned by God, to be one of God's family, to be a child of God. Rest, renewal, regeneration was at the heart of the rhythm that was set into place by the creation story. There was a day for rest, 6 days of work. On the seventh day you shall rest. And in Leviticus 25, this pattern is set that every 7 years the land has a Sabbath rest, and every 50 the land gets a year to reset, to start over, to be restored. There are little ways that we can put these kinds of actions into practice. We may not be landowners who can give our lands rest. We don't grow any crops on our land, so what does that look like? But what might be more fitting for our context is to think about taking a break from consuming the earth and the things of the earth in a way that are at odds with the natural rhythm and seasons that we see, and to sort of help identify that imbalance. One small thing that I think of is eating strawberries when they're supposed to be in season instead of in the middle of winter just because we can. Or taking a year and not buying anything new, with perhaps the exception of food. Being thoughtful about our purchases and where we're putting our money and what are we consuming with those dollars. Recycling as much as is possible and thinking twice about the amount of trash that we make. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building on it. Each builder must choose with care how to build on it. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one that has been laid. The foundation is Christ Jesus. The whole of the passage from 1 Corinthians 3 is talking about the church. The parts that were read for us this morning focuses on Paul's response to the church in Corinth who was struggling with who was their leader, who did they follow, who owns their church. Paul is laying it out for them as clearly as he possibly can. Short answer, God. Longer answer, as he unfolds it in the chapter, not one single one of us. And that principle applies to us today. There's a fair amount of confusion these days about why church exists and who church exists for. There's been this distinct move to church being personal and about my needs and how my needs will be met. And the church, and even more, that God will be at service to whatever I am seeking, which is different than what anyone else might be seeking. But my needs win over others every time. There is conversation about the ways that the church has failed me as a person for any number of reasons. Be it the people who make up the church, the leaders have failed us, the idea of this institution has failed us, and that the institution is really God with a small g. The church is flawed, and that shouldn't be a surprise to any of us, because the church will always be flawed, because we're all humans, and humans always mess up at some point. Sometimes we get close to being near to right and things go well. But in my experience with church, that's more exception than the norm. Why? Because I think that we own the church. when we start to think that we own the church, that somehow church is here to serve us, that somehow my needs have to be met on a regular basis over the needs of my brothers and sisters who come here with me, that somehow church needs to look like I think it needs to look, with the right leaders in place who will do what we want them to do, we all get caught in about 5 seconds, each and every one of us. A commentator whose words I've been reading since last summer offered this reflection on the passage in Corinthians and the rising sense of the owners of the church being the people. I think summed it up well, but also brings some words of challenge. And I quote, "If it is God's church, people do not determine its goals or strategies. Discernment replaces decision-making. The question is not, what do we want to do, but what does God want to do? It's not the same thing. Believing that all members have a perspective and gifts to contribute to the discernment of God's will, does not lead to the conclusion that all members have an equal vote in decisions. So how is a church structured when it belongs to God? How does it discern God's will? How does it organize itself to do God's will?" Author Richard Hayes points out that the church is not a democracy. Christian leaders are accountable to another authority. What is required is faithfulness to God, with or without the support of popular opinion in the church. End quote. As I've been reading this, I've been wondering about the kinds of questions that we've been asking lately as a congregation. Do we start with, what do we want? Or do we start with, what does God want to do? As we think about ownership, ways that we think we own the earth, the land, the animals, the fruits of the earth, the church, the people who work for us, the outcome of everything that we can declare to be ours, is it time for us to start asking the question, what does God want to do?